We'll show you the basics of what you need to know about safely operating electric table saws. Hopefully, by investing a little bit of time now watching this presentation, you'll eliminate a possible lifetime problem because of what can happen in only a split second.
Of course, this presentation is not meant to replace the information and advice contained in the instruction manual. Be sure you completely read and understand the instruction manual and any warning labels before using your table saw. The instruction manual is also the first place to look if you have any questions.
Well, let's get started. First, we're going to ensure that the workspace is properly set up and arranged.
A table saw should be used only in a well-lit area that is free from distractions. You want to avoid working in places where bystanders, children, or pets may disturb you and break your concentration. The workspace should also be clean and dry. Cluttered work areas are accidents waiting to happen. Floors should not be slippery, and there should be nothing around the working area that could cause you to slip, trip, or fall.
With the work area free from potential hazards, we can now turn our attention to the operator to be sure he or she is properly attired.
When using a table saw, avoid loose-fitting clothing or dangling objects like jewelry or neckties. Long hair should be tied back, and long sleeves should be rolled up above the elbows. We want to be sure that nothing can be caught in rotating parts and possibly drag you into the blade.
Additionally, you should wear non-skid closed-toe shoes, a dust mask, and safety glasses. Keep in mind the sawing operation can be very noisy, so it's a good idea to protect your hearing and use earplugs.
And it goes without saying that you should never operate a table saw or any other power tool when you are tired or when you are under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or prescription medications.
Now let's take a look at the basics of making cuts using a table saw.
Always be sure the saw is in good working order before beginning any project. So with the machine unplugged, do a visual check to see that no parts are loose and that nothing is broken. If any part is missing, malfunctioning, or damaged, do not use the saw until that part is repaired or replaced.
This is particularly true for blade guards. Many people remove the blade guards, thinking they're more trouble than they're worth. But consider that according to the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, over 90% of table saw injuries are to the hand or finger. These injuries include cuts, 65%, fractures, 11%, and even amputations, 9%. Using a blade guard, along with proper technique, can eliminate many of these injuries.
Clear the table saw of any wood scraps or tools. When it is time to plug in the saw, be sure the power switch is in the off position to eliminate the chance of accidental startup.
A table saw is intended to cut wood, wood-like, or plastic materials. You can cut through the workpiece or cut partially through, making a non-through cut. There are two basic types of through cuts, cross cuts and rip cuts.
When cross-cutting, you are cutting the wood across the grain. This cut is performed with the blade elevated a bit higher than the thickness of the workpiece, and you use the miter gauge. You must hold the edge of the workpiece firmly against the miter gauge. Then slowly push it forward through the blade. Never use the rip fence as a stop or length gauge.
If the workpiece is too small to be safely supported by the miter gauge, use a wood facing attached to the miter gauge or some other cross-cutting jig or fixture. In order to keep your fingers away from the blade, the workpiece must be clamped to the miter gauge.
Miter cuts are cross cuts cut at an angle other than 90 degrees. The miter gauge is set for the desired angle, and the cut is made in the same fashion as a cross cut.
Rip sawing is cutting with the grain of the wood or down the length of the workpiece. Again, the blade is elevated to a height just above the thickness of the workpiece, but this time the rip fence is used to control the width of the cut. Make sure the rip fence is parallel to the blade and securely locked in place.
When ripping, you should apply the feed force to the portion of the workpiece between the saw blade and the rip fence. Use one hand to push the workpiece forward and the other hand to hold the workpiece against the fence. Never push the workpiece into the side of the blade. This can result in the workpiece binding and kicking back. Whenever possible, the forward feed hand should straddle the rip fence while pushing the workpiece through the blade.
A special type of rip cut is a bevel rip cut. When performing a bevel rip cut, always place the fence to the side opposite of the blade tilt. Bevel ripping with the guard tilted toward the fence may not allow the use of the push stick and will wedge the workpiece between the blade and the fence. On this particular table saw, the blade tilts to the right. Just as you would with straight rip cuts, you should apply the feed force to the portion of the workpiece between the saw blade and the rip fence. Use one hand to push the workpiece forward and one hand to hold the workpiece against the fence.
Never rip cut a workpiece that is twisted, warped, or does not have a straight edge. Otherwise, the workpiece may wedge between the blade and the fence and possibly cause kickback.
Use a push stick for ripping widths of 2 inches to 6 inches and an auxiliary fence and push block for ripping widths narrower than 2 inches. Remember, if your hand or fingers are within 6 inches of the blade, you're too close to be able to react in the event of kickback, and you may be injured. Feather boards are devices that can be used to hold the work down on the table or against the fence to help contain the workpiece should kickback occur. Feather boards should be positioned so that they do not push the workpiece against the side of the blade.
A groove is a channel cut made with the grain or down the length of the workpiece. This cut requires using the rip fence, as when making a rip cut to support the workpiece.
A rabbet cut is a step-like cut made on the end or edge of a workpiece. Here, the rip fence is used as a guide when rabbeting the length of the board. The miter gauge is used when cutting the short end of the workpiece. Regardless of the type of cut you need to make, there are some general procedures you should always follow. Doing so will help control the two greatest potential hazards when using a table saw: contact with the saw blade and workpiece kickback.
Kickback most often is the result of operator inattention and misuse of the table saw. The major causes of kickback are improper alignment of the fence to blade, improper support of the workpiece, a twisted or warped workpiece, a dull or damaged blade, and overly aggressive workpiece feeding.
During kickback, the workpiece pinches the back of the saw blade, rises from the table, and is thrown back at the operator. Kickback can cause serious harm, having enough force to drive the workpiece through drywall or anything else in its path. Following some simple procedures and setups, kickback and possible injuries can be avoided.
Use common sense. Do not try to cut large sheets that you cannot guide with the fence or miter gauge. Keep in mind that long or wide workpieces need extra support, such as an auxiliary table or a roller stand. This will keep the workpiece from tipping during the cutting operation.
And never try to cut more than one workpiece at a time. Stacked workpieces can shift or bind on the blade, leading to unexpected contact with the blade and possible kickback.
When cutting, always stand to one side and never directly in line with the blade. Never position your hands or fingers in the path of the saw blade. You could slip into the blade if you apply uneven or excessive force, or if there are any irregularities in the workpiece. Never reach behind and pull the stock to finish the cut.
Always use the blade guard for every through-cutting operation. The guard system includes the hood, splitter, and anti-kickback pawls. The hood protects the operator's hands from contact with the blade. The splitter keeps the wood from pinching the blade. And the anti-kickback pawls engage the material and prevent it from being kicked back towards the operator. The guard system is designed to reduce the intensity of a kickback and to keep your hands away from the spinning blades.
Remember that accident reports investigated by the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission show that table saw accidents typically occur when the table saw is being operated improperly and/or without the benefit of the blade guard. Never cut freehand. Use the rip fence for rip cuts and the miter gauge for cross cuts and miter cuts. Unsupported or improperly supported workpieces may twist or bind the workpiece, causing kickback.
The miter gauge and the rip fence should never be used together. They can act against each other and bind against the saw blade and cause kickback.
Never use the rip fence as a length guide for repeated cross-cutting. Use a miter gauge or stop block to provide safe workpiece clearance.
Start and finish the cut from the operator side of the table saw. Always push, never pull the workpiece through the blade. Never feed material from the back of the saw. Do not release the workpiece until it has been pushed completely past the saw blade.
Never reach behind or over the saw blade while it is spinning. If kickback occurs, your hands could be drawn into the blade. This is especially true when performing non-through cutting operations where the blade guard is not used.
When the cut is finished, turn the saw off and let the blade stop spinning before attempting to remove cutoffs, scrap, or the workpiece from the table. A coasting blade still contains a lot of energy and can cause a serious injury.
Ongoing continued safe operation of a table saw also depends on proper maintenance. The product instruction manual details the user serviceable and maintainable parts. Always read and follow the manufacturer's maintenance recommendations.
Keep the blade clean and sharp. Dull blades, or blades with resin buildup, tend to bind in the workpiece. And use only blades and accessories designed to fit your model of table saw.
Of course, if the saw is in need of repair, have it serviced by qualified repair personnel using the proper replacement parts.
Well, that's it for this introduction to safely using table saws. Remember, always read and follow the instructions, warnings, and safety rules that came with the saw. Use them as a reference whenever you have any questions.
A table saw is a very useful and popular power tool. But don't forget, it can be dangerous and that an accident can happen in just a split second.